Everyone, so this is lecture 8 on invasion biogeography today. The accompanying reading is the Fridley and Sachs paper on the evolutionary imbalance hypothesis. So another hypothesis to add to your pocket of hypotheses. This paper is definitely written for pretty high level and specific scientific audience. So I recognize that. Do your best to get through the, the introduction and then take a look at the figures because the results themselves are really pretty neat. And I'm going to talk about them a little bit more in a second. So in class so far, we have, and this is the framework from the Catford paper, right? So she says, forget all of these very specific individual hypotheses, that many of those hypotheses are really focused on the B part, right? The biological characteristics of the invaded community and the biological characteristics of the invading species, these kind of community level interactions, because a lot of invasion ecology is ecology, right? So in ecology, we focus on those community interactions, community ecology, impacts what's actually going on when one species invades a native community. But there are these other two pieces in there too, right? The propagule pressure, we've got the abiotic characteristics, and maybe there's more to explore in these other pieces. So when we've talked about the biological characteristics of the invading species so far, we have thought in terms of those species traits, like how fast does it grow? How many offspring does it produce? How tolerant is it of different climatic conditions? We haven't really thought about other kind of traits of that species, like, for example, what does its evolutionary history look like? Or what does its native range look like? These kind of things that aren't quite traits that maybe interact with some of these other pieces too, but that may be important ultimately in the invasion process. So invasion biogeography is different from invasion ecology. It's using a different disciplinary approach to try to understand invasions. And biogeography generally is geography, so it's a spatial approach. It's understanding more about a species, so an invasive species in this case, using information about spatial location of that species. Right? So we're asking a question that's very location specific, a question about where and what are the conditions about where that species is located. Invasion biogeography tends to focus more on the sort of introduction spread. I just discovered the laser pointer tool in PowerPoint, so I'm going to annoy you all with it. So we have human-mediated dispersal and propagule pressure, right? That is something that is very spatial. Abiotic characteristics like climate conditions, also something that's very spatial, something that we can put on a map. Biological characteristics also to some degree, something that we might have information about spatially. And so if we have spatial information about those, then maybe we can use that information to broaden what we're learning about specific invaded ecosystems. Right? Because there's only so much you can learn from kind of individual field experiments, lab experiments, greenhouse experiments about how species are interacting. Species are interacting across a lot of different ecosystem types, across a lot of different native community types. And it's just impossible to say we're going to do, an ecological experiment in all of these different places. These red dots are where a species called cheatgrass or Bromus tectorum has been found invading the North America. That's a lot of different locations across the US. And so we can't necessarily use ecological tools to assess every single one of those potential invasions. We need we need to add different approaches to our toolbox. So I'm going to give you some examples in this lecture of how geography has been used to assess invasion, so this sort of invasion biogeography field. focus on that idea of, so an example one from propagule pressure, I'm going to give you a couple of examples of things related to abiotic environment, especially climate, and an example of the biotic characteristics of the invaded ecosystem at broad geographic scales too. All right, so let's start with the first one. Geography of propagule pressure. So this is a map that was put together some number of years ago, but early in others, that is a compilation of introduction threat of invasive species. And what is this map based on? It's based on, at a country to sub-country level, overall trade volumes. So both bulk import volumes coming into those countries. And of course, that's a place where stowaways or hitchhikers can come in. It's also airport volume across the US. So if people are accidentally bringing in invasive pests in their luggage. And there's also sort of specific layers of plant imports to each of these different countries and sub-country levels, and pet imports. And so plants and pets are the major pathways for plant and vertebrate introductions, and also plant imports serve as a proxy for hitchhikers of pathogens and pests on plants. So one thing that geography can do is to give us these types of risk assessments at large spatial areas, knowing not specifically about the individual species, but using these kind of spatial proxies for how those species, how invasive species are likely to be introduced, and then highlighting areas that, we might not have seen as potential hotspots of invasion previously. The other cool part about this paper is that another big piece that they looked at was at policy for all of the different countries of the world in terms of both proactive capacity. So that is, the country has a watch list that says, you're not allowed to import the species unless we inspect it or unless it passed a risk assessment type of protocol. And reactive capacity, which is basically, you have managers that are funded through the a national government or subnational government to actually go out and address invasive species problems within your country. And so what they found is most of the policies around the world, so blue means that they have high capacity, so a lot of policies focused on that approach. And red means that they have low capacity, so not much in the way of policy to help reduce the risk of invasions. So you can see that there's a lot more reactive capacity that is in the world. We, once we recognize that something is invasive, a lot of times we come up with policies to try to stop the spread of those invasive species. But what we were missing in much of the world, and I would argue that this is still true in North America, even in the places that are blue on here, we're still missing a fair bit of proactive capacity, which is basically the idea that you are not going to import a species until you can prove to me that it is unlikely to be invasive, or that we are going to, inspect those plants that are coming in for pests and pathogens, or we are going to, regulate what types of herptiles or something can be brought in as pets, because we know that that's a high likelihood of becoming invasive. So those are some kind of fun examples of how geography can address sort of broadly these questions of invasive species risk. Another thing that geography does pretty well is to compare and look at abiotic conditions. So, and I would say this is probably the largest focus in terms of science and biogeography science that has gone on to date in invasion science, is trying to say, okay, if we know something about the abiotic conditions of the native range or the native plus the invaded range, can we then say, well, here are a bunch of other similar climates in the world. These are areas that are potentially at risk of this species. And this approach works, fairly well, because generally in the world, there are lots of different ecosystems and climate zones that are kind of similar. So, if you look at, for example, the brown on here, which is all of the desert regions of the world, right? You've got desert regions in Australia, you've got multiple desert regions in Asia, the Middle East, and Africa, and in Western North America, and then a little bit, on the coast of South America. So if all of those are similar climatic conditions, then even though we might have totally different species assemblages in those areas, the species that evolved in Australia may well do just fine in the deserts of Africa because the climate conditions are suitable for that species. That's how they evolved, under similar climate conditions. And then later on, how they might interact with the native communities is a question that we could narrow down after identifying risk based on climate. One of the hypotheses that we talked about a little bit last week was the pre-adaptation hypothesis, right? So the pre-adaptation hypothesis says that an invasive species is more likely to establish if the conditions in that novel range are similar to those from its native range. And so this is not, even though the pre-adaptation hypothesis a lot of times focuses on the native community similarity to the invasive species, it's a lot broader than that. It's not just looking at biotic interactions, it's actually looking at abiotic conditions. So basically, abiotic conditions from a biogeography standpoint are often easier to measure than biotic conditions. And so what I mean by that is, if you can say a species is present in Massachusetts, then that tells you something about the climate conditions. It must have some freezing tolerance. It likes it relatively wet. It can handle these big swings between winter and summer in terms of climate ranges. That's easier to approximate what that physiological tolerance is than actually growing all of the trees, individually to measure, well, if we make it this cold or this hot or whatever, how does that species actually respond? So here's an example of what we might infer about physiological tolerance if we had a gradient geographically of that species abundance, right? So if you've got a lot of species in one particular geography, and that particular geography has, this type of climate conditions, whatever those are, a certain range of temperature and precipitation, and then your population drops off down here when it gets too hot, your population drops off down here when it gets too cold or too dry or whatever the conditions are, you can say something about the likely physiological tolerance of the species based on its geography. Because it's really hard to go in and actually measure the physiological tolerance of a bunch of trees. Trees are really long-lived, right? So if you think about what that would require, you'd have to grow a species in a whole bunch of different environmental conditions, see how it performs in an experimental condition. That might be possible to do if you're measuring fruit flies where their generation time is like a week or whatever it is, but not so easy if you're measuring a tree where the generation is, decades in terms of going from a seedling to sapling to juvenile to actually reproducing adult. So all of that is to say that geography can be used as a proxy for physiological tolerance. And so what we would typically do is we have a bunch of distribution data for a particular species. We then extract, so these points exist in space. We also know something about the climate in those locations, in this case, precipitation, dry, wet. We might also know temperature, that we could put on another axis. Maybe we're focused on winter temperature, freezing temperatures. Maybe we're focused on summer maximum temperatures. Maybe we want to do all of those things. Ultimately, what we can do is take this geographic information and put it in framework that is in climate space, right? So let's say climate variable 1 is precipitation, climate variable 2 is annual mean temperature. Our species doesn't exist anywhere. It exists within a very particular subset of climate conditions. And then if you know this subset of climate conditions, you can take that information and put it back in a map form, because we can say, well, where does this set of climate conditions exist spatially within North America, within the world, wherever it is that you're interested in mapping. And this gives us a risk assessment, right? So we can say, if this is an invasive species, here's what we've modeled for suitable climate, and this is what that map looks like once you put it back into a map format. And there's a word for this particular type of modeling, which is called species distribution modeling. And the idea behind this is that you can predict the potential range of invasion of a species based on the occurrences that you know about of where that species has already invaded. And this doesn't have to be just climate. So it could be information about soils, for example, information about topography. It could be information about biotic community characteristics. The main challenge is just whether we have spatial data that's continuous and consistent for the type of information that you're hoping to model. All right, so here's just a couple of examples. So this is a species distribution model for ice plant Carpobrotus edulis, which is native to South Africa, so native down here in the Western Cape of South Africa, introduced broadly in the Mediterranean, in other Mediterranean-like climates. So for example, the coast of Southern California, the coast of South America, and the coasts of Australia. And so this is a model from highly suitable to less suitable that essentially identifies all of the Mediterranean climates of the world, because that tends to be where this particular plant does really well. You can also use the same approach to project future ranges of invasive species. So this is a map that you saw when we talked about invasive species and climate change for this species called Kogan grass. And Kogan grass right now is mostly down here on the Gulf Coast. But if you change the climate conditions, so you put essentially this type of map, you take this information of where suitable climate is, except then rather than projecting it on current climate, we're projecting it instead on future climate models. And that gives us this information about, well, it could actually expand all the way up into the Midwest and Mid-Atlantic, in this case, by the end of the century. So those are some examples of species distribution modeling, looking at this abiotic matches between a species distribution and its potential range, its potential risk. There have also been some really neat biogeography studies looking at traits, not just of the invaded range, but thinking about traits of the native range of those invasive species. So again, what can we learn about where the species came from that can give us some insight into risk and where the species might be going? So two studies that I want to highlight. One is the idea that invasive species have broader native ranges. And the other is the paper that you read, the Fridley and Sachs paper, the idea that invasive species come from more diverse native ranges. So let's start with that first one, the broad native ranges. All right, so this is a figure from a paper by Higgins and Richardson from 2014. They had lots of data about the distributions of two different genera. So first were all the species of Australian eucalyptus trees and all of the species of Australian acacia, which are sort of like a shrubby tree species. There are lots of different species in both of those genera. So some of those species have been introduced to a new range, but they didn't successfully naturalize. So they made it there, they might still be in cultivation, but they're not, they don't have established populations. Some of those species were introduced and successfully naturalized. Those are the pink ones, but they didn't become invasive. And then some of those species did successfully become invasive. So they were introduced, they naturalized, and they're spreading away from those populations. So those are the purple ones, the invasives. And what we're showing on this graph is the native range size. So this is in half-degree grid cells. So just a more larger range size over here, smaller range size over here. And these are essentially histograms, right? So where did the species of introduced, naturalized, and invasive species fall in terms of the breadth of their native range? And so you can see that the invasive species relative to naturalized, relative to introduced, have much broader native ranges. Naturalized slightly broader than introduced. And so this tells us that basically you're more likely to be invasive if you have a broader native range. The problem with biogeography, though, is that while we can see this pattern, we don't know anything about the mechanism of why this is actually happening, right? That's where we would need a lot more kind of experimental ecology or something like that to try to figure out what's going on. So we might come up with some hypotheses. So for example, if you have a broad native range, that means that you might be more likely to tolerate a broader set of environmental conditions, set of abiotic conditions. Broader native range also means that you might have greater exposure to different competitors, different predators. So you've had to duke it out evolutionarily with a lot of different species. And so that might make you fitter ultimately. Broader ranges also mean that you have more exposure to people, right? So people are more likely to find you earlier on and maybe introduce you into the horticulture, ornamental plant trade, whatever that is. And that might give you more opportunities through propagule pressure to actually be introduced to lots of different regions. So some different hypotheses as to why we might see this pattern in geography, but ultimately, kind of regardless of which of those hypotheses or other hypotheses might be the underlying cause of this pattern, we still see a risk, right? We still see this risk association between invasive species and broad native ranges. And so if we know that information, that's sort of a trait basically of a species, if we know that that species is a widespread, broad ranged species, then that tells us, gee, maybe that species has a higher risk of invasion. Maybe we don't want to import it. Another piece of that you read in the Fridley and Sachs paper, or will read in the Fridley and Sachs paper, is this hypothesis that invasive plants are likely to come from more diverse native regions. Right. And the sort of mechanism behind this is that if you come from a very diverse area, like the one on the prairie on the left kind of thing, then you would have evolved with lots of different competitors, different predators. And so when you've got lots of different competitors, then if you want your species to persist over time, then that species is going to have to evolve more efficient traits, grow bigger, faster, stronger, more efficiently, be more competitive. Otherwise, it's going to go extinct within that ecosystem. Conversely, if you evolved in a system where there were very few competitors, only a couple of species that you had to compete with, then maybe you're kind of a less evolved species, a less fit species, because you didn't have that strong force of natural selection to push you to be better at competing. So you don't kind of become your peak competitor, and maybe you're less likely to be a problem elsewhere, to be invasive elsewhere. And so that reminds us then of, well, why is it in the world that we have some places that look really diverse and have lots of different competition in other areas where we have less diversity? And so just to recap, when we talked about the empty niche hypothesis, one of the things that really links to that is the idea of island biogeography, that species diversity is a function of colonization and extinction, right? So if you are a small island, for example, far away from a mainland, it takes a lot for a new species to arrive. And maybe the species, because you're a small island, you don't have as many resources, maybe that species is pretty likely to be extinct, to become extinct quickly. If you're a large island far away from a mainland, like the islands of Hawaii, for example, you've got lots of different resources, a very nice place to be a plant, not too many other plants coming in, or birds, or any taxa, hard to get there. And so you've got it relatively easy in that area. You may not have to have as much evolutionary pressure to really duke it out and become a super competitive species. So, and then of course you've got your mainland systems, these areas where presumably everybody has relatively free movement around here. Dispersal is relatively easy, not blocked by something like an ocean or a mountain range or something like that. And so you end up with higher competition because, there's lots of species there to begin with, a longer history of evolution, lots of resources, and free movement of species. So that's a reason why you might have some native ranges that have more competitors and fewer competitors. And then, of course, we can look at this on a map, right? So there's a lot of geographic variation and diversity around the world. This is a map for vascular plants. So tropical areas of the world, lots of competition, lots of competition. You would see similar maps if you did the same thing and mapped diversity of invertebrates or vertebrates. Generally, you have higher diversity in the tropics. So we've got some patterns of differences in diversity that might be related to those kind of island effects. Some of them that might be, there are some areas on Earth that just have tons of resources, like tropical areas. Some ecosystems that are just really old and so have had a lot of time to, they've been land for a long time. They weren't underwater recently. And so they've just got a lot of diversity, a lot of history of that competition. So the idea in Fridley and Sachs is that if you have come from one of those areas where your native range has high phylogenetic diversity, lots of different species, lots of different competitors competing in different ways, then your probability should be higher of becoming invasive. These graphs are both what's called logistic regression, which basically means that you're modeling the probability of not being invasive, so that's a 0, versus being invasive, so that's a 1. So this line that you're seeing is just increasing probability. The closer you get to 1, the more likely you would sort of flip that species from not invasive to invasive. The gray lines on here are both introduced and so introduced species, but not necessarily species that have naturalized. So that's what they mean by casuals excluded. So this black line in both of these are species that are known to have naturalized. Some of those species have gone on to become invasive, and they're more likely to have gone on to become invasive if they came from a real diverse native range. We have these two examples of Eastern North America and the Czech Republic. That might seem slightly random, but different scientists in different areas collect the information that you're looking for. So you use what information is available to you in terms of invasive plant data. Turns out we have pretty good information from North America and pretty good information from the Czech Republic, because there is a lab of excellent plant botanists in the Czech Republic and labs of excellent plant botanists in North America. And then one last thing that I wanted to mention in terms of biogeography and using geographical traits of the invasive species invaded range. So again, we're going after this from a geographic perspective. We have talked also about the biotic resistance hypothesis. Biotic resistance hypothesis says that if an ecosystem is more diverse, so again, this is the invaded ecosystem or the recipient ecosystem, not the native range. The recipient ecosystem has higher diversity, then it's more likely to resist invasion because it would have more competitors and it could potentially exclude those novel species arriving, it might have more predators that would eat that novel species arriving. And so the idea of biotic resistance is that higher diversity, higher richness of your ecosystem leads to more resistance. So this pattern, this question of biotic resistance has been studied a lot at the plot scale, right? It's really a community level question of what's going on, at that spot. Does an invasive establish or not? What does the community look like? A lot of experimental ecology is focused on biotic resistance. But it turns out that we can address this question using a geographic framework too, and that gives us a little bit more power to say that this is a phenomenon that happens everywhere, that it's not just in the specific ecosystems that have been studied, but that we can measure it across all of these different, so this is North America and North American ecoregions, and within each of those ecoregions, different habitat types, forests, herbaceous shrublands, woodlands. And this is a spatial study that was done using vegetation surveys that were collected by the National Park Service in about 150 national parks. They had about 12,000 plots within all of those. And so, basically this says that because you have this negative relationship between native richness, so native richness is increasing to the right, and the likelihood that non-natives will occur, the negative relationship tells you, supports the hypothesis of biotic resistance. More native species, less non-native species. And this study, I should say, was done by my graduate students. So this is a UMass sourced biogeography study. All right, so thanks for listening. Don't forget the accompanying reading and the quiz questions for Fridley and Sachs on that evolutionary imbalance hypothesis, and I will see you in class.